Good morning and welcome, everyone. We are 11 o'clock on Thursday, the 13th of August. Sunny day in London this morning, although not as hot as it was yesterday. I'm here in VMA Group's office just off Tottenham Court Road. I have been actually for the last couple of weeks now. Some of you may have ventured back into yours, or some of you may be zooming in from home. We shall see. But thanks ever so much for joining us this morning. My name's Andrew Harvey. I am the CEO of VMA Group. Some of you dialing in may have spoken to me before. I'm sure had some dealings with VMA Group in the past. But I'm delighted to be speaking with you all this morning, and also further delighted to be joined by my colleagues, Matthew Gibbs. And of course, also, there you go, a little wave from Matthew. Thank you, Matthew. And also, of course, Stuart, not Holt. Thank you, Stuart. Yeah, a little wave, who is our guest speaker this morning, and delighted that Stuart is joining us on with a very topical topic to go through. But before I introduce Matthew and Stuart, I thought I might just provide a bit of an update, or maybe a bit of background on VMA Group, some of the stuff that we're doing around these Sing events, and also perhaps a bit of an update on the market as well from an interim perspective, interim contract, comms, marketing, etc., which I'm sure you'll probably be interested to hear. So for those that don't know, just to put it into context in terms of why it's relevant, VMA Group is a specialist recruitment business. We're 43 years old this year, same age as me. I know you're thinking I don't look it, but yes, 43 years old. VMA Group very much focused on comms, marketing and digital recruitment. In this day and age, we actually have offices in London, we've got an office in Manchester, one in Paris, and also one in Amsterdam. So actually looking at the interim and contract market, we also work, I say, all across the UK, but also in Europe too. And actually it may be relevant to know that some of the work we've been doing in Europe over the last 12 months or so, often we do end up moving professional interims from the UK to work on some of those projects in Europe. So it'll be interesting to see how the next few months pan out, particularly with Brexit still on the rise. And just when you thought you'd never hear that word again, it popped up a few months ago. It is still there, and that may throw up some opportunities for contract recruitment further down the line. Again, it is worth just reiterating, I think, VMA Group, we are very much an interim and contract recruitment business in addition to the permanent recruitment that we do. That interim part of our business is a very large part of our business, and something that we continue to look to grow and develop going forward. So I say hopefully many of you on the call will have worked with us in some capacity before, but I hope as things develop over the coming weeks and months, we'll have more opportunities that we can share with the good people in our network. So I suppose the question is, just in terms of the market at the moment, where are things? So considering all things COVID, what is actually going on in comms, in marketing, in interim, and in the recruitment sector generally? I think it's fair to say that things have definitely changed. And over the last few weeks and months, I've been speaking to many hundreds, literally hundreds of comms and marketing professionals. And we have seen a real shift in where the market is. As you can imagine, when COVID first broke, every organisation we spoke to within the space of about 2 weeks was entirely focused on employee health and well-being. Any sort of conversations around recruitment or even profit or sales just completely evaporated, and every organisation was focused on that employee health and well-being piece. But actually, and understandably so, that has now changed. Without a shadow of a doubt, we have seen a real shift. And I would say that started probably 6 to 8 weeks ago. And of course, health and well-being is still a massive priority for organisations, but there's been a real shift in terms of organisations looking to the future. We're speaking to business leaders, CEOs, comms directors, and actually those business leaders saying, look, we're still going to protect our staff, of course we will, but we also need to continue now to trade as a business. I mean, in some ways, it's kind of, we need to trade our way out of this recession. We need to be competitive. We need to differentiate ourselves. We need to do lots of different things to get our business back to where we want it to be. And so that focus on the financial pressures of COVID and sort of recessionary pressures have meant that actually, organisations now are very focused on the future, not just returning to the office, but actually, say, returning to being trading businesses, being back up and running in terms of where they want to be. And I think perhaps maybe in previous recessions, companies have just will cut and will retreat, and that will help us. I think that, that is happening, but also I'd say we are seeing a shift towards more proactive activity for organisations. To put that into context, over the last 4 weeks, so beginning of August into July, we've seen a 25% increase in the number of vacancies that are coming to the market in terms of comms, marketing, and contract and permanent as well. So if you look at April, May, June, the market was very depressed. But as I say, over the last 4 weeks, we've seen a 25% increase. And actually looking at this week again, looking at some of the stats that we're seeing this week is showing that same trend. So we'll be the 5th week of that positive growth. However, there is still a long way to go. And again, I calculate that the market is still, so the comms, marketing, interim recruitment market is still probably about 50 to 60% of where it was last year. So we're probably about half of where we were last year. So there is still a long way to go. Interestingly, again, speaking to a lot of the organizations that we deal with, I think there are a fair amount of people, and again, I've not counted them up specifically, but I'd say probably a good 85% of organizations that are talking about returning to the office in September. So it's either September for some or January. Or if you're a big tech business, then some people are saying never again, we'll never work in the office again. But I think in reality, a lot of people are saying September, others are saying January. Interestingly, being back here, our office just off Oxford Street, there's actually still a lot of coffee shops and restaurants that are closed up, boarded up, but they have got signs in the window which say we'll be opening again in September. I saw some more yesterday. So I think, we're seeing that improvement. I think we'll see a little bit more in September as well. So my line when I speak to the people at the moment is that things are slowly getting better. They're not slowly getting worse. But I'm no scientist. My glass is half full, optimist. So yeah, I say things are slowly getting better. So just briefly, in terms of our Sing events, we have been, so Sing, Senior Interim Networking Group, short and catchy. We've been running these Sing events now for a number of years. We run all sorts of networking events for various topics and have done for many years. Again, a good opportunity for people to come together to discuss challenges and opportunities and talk about things that are of particular interest, and actually share case studies as well. Always very helpful to do, and always, it's always helpful to spend time networking with people in the industry and hearing what other people are up to. We'll continue to do many more in the future, and that's really what today's webinar is about. So it's about sharing ideas, talking about very relevant topic, crisis comms, and what people have been doing. And obviously we're, I say, delighted to have Stuart on the call this morning. I think it's to say Stuart's very much got the t-shirt when it comes to crisis comms, swine flu, COVID, I'm sure whatever the next crisis is, Stuart's going to be involved. He'll be right there at the front of it. And we've worked directly with Stuart at VMAGROUP as well. So we know that he's very good at what he does. And that's where we're pleased that he's going to be sharing some stuff with us this morning. But I think that's probably enough from me. I'm just going to hand over briefly to Matt. He might just give a little bit of more of a flavour of what we see going on at the moment from a job perspective, and then we'll hand over to Stuart. So Matthew, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning everybody, and welcome, and thank you for joining. And again, big thank you to Stuart for joining us today and discussing his recent COVID-19 crisis communications case study. I'm sure everybody is, of course, here for Stuart, but I'll be short and sweet and hopefully give you a bit of an insight into the market over the last 4 to 5 months or so since we've been going through this really difficult time. As Andrew said, so for anybody that hasn't met me before, my name's Matt. I work in the contract team and have done so for the last 4.5 years or so at VMAGROUP. I manage corporate communications interim positions. Traditionally, I have worked more on the internal communications, employee engagement and change communications. But the remit has broadened up to more wider corporate communications roles, PR, media relations, public affairs, investor relations over the past a few months or so. We just thought it'd be a good idea for me to share what's been happening day to day as I've been managing the roles, as I've been working with clients, candidate side, and just to give a bit of an insight, a bit of a flavour of what we've seen, I guess, over the past, since lockdown, really. So I'll be covering 5 or 6 points today, like I say, both client side and candidates, just to share that insight. So first and foremost, I thought I'd just share the roles that I've been working on, the sectors of the companies that are hiring, and the jobs that I've been managing and trying to place. So I think an interesting topic would be, yeah, as I say, well, what companies are hiring. You know, believe it or not, we have had briefs from companies within the aviation sector. We have had briefs from companies in the retail sector. It really has been across the board. So I've recruited for 3 or 4 companies within the education sector, another sector which has been hit quite dramatically since lockdown. Companies in there, Pearson, King's College, even a school. The American school in London was one which didn't quite come to fruition, but they did initially need an interim head of communications for 6 months. Other sectors have included mining, Anglo-American, membership bodies, communications agencies, financial services, media, and housing associations. So although yes, job flow is down year on year quite drastically, there are still companies hiring, and that's across the board from officer up to director level. So that there is a bit of positivity. With regards to we like to do a bit of a breakdown, fixed term contracts and interim. So the majority of people out there do prefer to work for limited companies. They prefer traditionally to work on day rates. We've seen around 60% of the jobs that I've worked on and we've managed in the contract team be on that kind of interim day rates, whereas the other 40% have been fixed term contract briefs. We haven't seen that hasn't really changed pre-lockdown to now. So I guess that's fairly positive in that sense. I won't talk too much about R35 today. I know that's been you know a sour point, and we've had many sessions, webinars about R35 over the past 6 months or so. But I just wanted to mention a few things that I've experienced, you know, since lockdown. We did have a company, I'd say unfortunately, but you know, I was working on a role at £600 a day, head of communications role for a financial services company. Went through 2 or 3 stages of the interview, advertised the role, of course, £600 a day. It wasn't until the offer stage that the company actually came to me and said, look, unfortunately, due to IR35 and due to being a little bit reluctant of engaging with a PSC, with a limited company, we have decided to offer the role, which is great news, but on a fixed term contract salary of 110k. So of course, I'm coming to somebody with a 110k job offer, so it's not the end of the world. But it's just to say that did kind of highlight more of a reluctance from companies to engage with the PSC. I've also worked with a few clients that have a not necessarily a blank, well, I guess you could call it a blanket approach. Yeah, they're not engaging with PSCs, they're not engaging with limited companies. The brief from the offset is, yes, we will pay on a day rate, but the successful candidate will need to work for an umbrella company. So that's 2 placements I've made. Again, one in the financial services and one in the educational sector. That from the offset, you know, would not engage with PSCs, which is unfortunate considering the IR35 delay into April 2021. It does essentially mean that contractors have the right to determine their own IR35 status, but there are still companies that are reluctant to engage. The next point that I just wanted to discuss is just with regards to hiring managers' requirements and the type of roles that we've recruited for. So traditionally in the contract team, as I'm sure you're aware, the majority of roles that we would manage would be change focused, project led. So that could be cultural change, HR change, tech, maybe M&A, you know, along those lines. However, with so many projects being put on hold, there's been a definite shift towards crisis communications, hence Stuart's case study today. And kind of stopgap roles, so where there's been maybe recruitment freezes in place, companies have been able to bring in contractors for a kind of stopgap while they're not able to recruit on a permanent basis. I guess an example of this was where a retail company came to me and said, look, we had planned to do a big cultural change program this year, so it was meant to start in January, February time. All hands on deck on crisis communications. That was kind of put to one side, but now the positive is that is now being relaunched, and there is more of a focus, I guess, to what Andrew's point around that kind of refocus on company business strategies. So I did recruit a 6-month contractor. That was a £500 a day position. They were able to go work for a limited company. They were able to make their own assessments, and that was just, I guess, reiterating what Andrew said about the shift maybe now towards those projects starting up again, which was positive to see. The third point I wanted to mention, I'm sure you may have seen in your job searches, and something which is interesting, is that clients are being a little bit more specific in their searches, with the market being fairly candidate heavy, candidate driven for various different reasons, the furlough scheme, redundancies, or people maybe just finishing a contract, or whatever it may be. Clients are seeing that they can be a little bit more particular in the candidate that they bring into the business. So again, traditionally within internal change communications, there hasn't necessarily been a need for sector-specific experience. In surveys that we've recently that we've run over the past few years, around 80 to 85% of hiring managers haven't requested sector-specific experience. However, I'm seeing that more often than not. The retail role that I worked on, for example, each candidate I had to submit had to have had extensive retail experience. The same with the education, the same with the membership body. Potentially maybe a little bit short-sighted, because it is very transferable, and that's what we try to influence and demonstrate with clients. But at the same time, they're saying that if I can get that sector experience, it may enable somebody to come in and hit the ground running a little bit more easily than if they didn't have that. So it's just something to note. The fourth point I wanted to mention is with regards to the communication that we've had with in-house recruitment teams. So of course we do have strong relationships with communicators, with heads and directors of communications, but across the board from officer to director level. But of course, lots of the work we do is with trying to bring in the business, speaking with the recruitment team, speaking with the in-house HR, talent acquisition, recruitment partners. And since lockdown, I've made a conscious effort to speak to every single one of our what we call our PSL contacts, that's preferred supplier list, ones that we have agreements in place already. Speaking with every single one of those recruitment contacts and seeing their, recruitment strategies. What are they doing? Are they hiring? Have they got a recruitment freeze? I can't tell you the amount of times that I heard the words, "I'm sorry, but we have a recruitment freeze. We're not hiring at the moment. Thank you, but there's nothing we can do for you." That was in March, April, May. But as Andrew said, there has been a shift, and there are more and more companies that are saying our recruitment freeze has been lifted. Although we may not have communications roles at the moment, we are releasing more jobs, and we are looking, positive signs. So, for example, Pearson, Diageo, Barclays, all companies that have said the same thing to me over the past few weeks. That links me on to our next point, is with regards to recruitment freezes. That doesn't always, the beauty of interim is that doesn't always affect interim, doesn't always affect contractors. So I have placed a few roles in companies that have got company-wide recruitment freezes, global recruitment freezes, but oh no, we can bring in an interim. It doesn't affect our headcount. It doesn't affect those kind of budgets. So I've placed two interims, an interim content and channels executive for a mining company, the £300, £350 a day role, sorry, for 6 months, which was really pleasing to see, and another interim internal communications manager position. Another point is that, again, going from a negative to a positive, when lockdown first came, there were many knee-jerk reactions from companies across the board of trying to cut costs. Where do they see their costs? They may see it as a contractor cost, whatever the day rate is. They've got short notice periods. Oh, maybe we can let these people go. So I think within a 1 or 2 week period post lockdown, around 30% of our contractor base was unfortunately let go within maybe a 1 week's notice or so. However, since late May, we haven't had one contractor lose their role, and we've seen pretty much 90 to I think pretty much 100% actually of contractors that were due to end between May and August have been extended. So we haven't lost one contractor since then, and we're actually in a place where our contractor base is growing rather than declining that we saw a few months ago. So they're my points. As I say, the majority of time we did want to spend on Stuart's case study today, and I'm sure that will take up probably 20-30 minutes. There will be a Q&A session at the end, so keep those questions in mind for myself, Andrew, or Stuart. And I just wanted to end with a few hints and tips. So I've got 3 or 4 hints and tips for you if you are in the market, if you are looking for a job. I don't know, we have 50 people on the call today, so there may be a high percentage of those looking for work at the moment. The first is that don't be put off by the large number of applications that you see for jobs. There is a tool on LinkedIn. There's a little a part of LinkedIn that shows you how many people have applied for each role. That can be 50, 100, 500. I think one of my colleagues actually had 1,100 applications for a role within a week. I posted a marketing role and had 600 applications within a day. it can be difficult for a recruiter to go through those, but we do go through all of those. And I can say that sometimes it's only 10% of those that are actually relevant. It's very easy nowadays for somebody to just click apply. It doesn't take much effort. There are so many people. I think I've had a French lawyer apply for a role. I've had I think a Vietnamese chef. And yeah, look, they're out of work. They want to apply for jobs, but it's just to say that recruiters can go through those very quickly and really just narrow that down to the like I say, 10%. Of people that are actually relevant. From those 10%, they may not be immediately available for a contract. They may not be the right seniority. So again, that narrows it down. So don't be put off by those large numbers. If you do feel as though your experience, your seniority, your availability, what you can offer does match, then don't be put off by those numbers. The second point is. Sorry, I just got a call come in. I'll just cancel that. The second point is with regards to locations. I haven't placed a role where somebody's had to interview face to face. I haven't placed a role where somebody's had to work in the office, really at all. If they haven't needed to, sometimes maybe once a week, if so, but not a huge amount. So, especially with contracting, you don't necessarily need to just have your geographical location. If you live in London or Bristol or Manchester, whatever it may be. Apply further afield. The roles are remote at the moment. Whether it be a 3-month, 6-month contract, the chances are it will be remote for the majority of that time. So, apply nationwide. Apply for roles in Europe. If it's remote, it's remote. I've actually one of the contractors we've placed before. She finished her contract in March, then she picked up a role working for a global financial services company. I'm quite conscious of the time, so I'm probably waffling a little bit, but I just wanted to tell this little story. She went on holiday to a family from, I think it's Bahamas or Barbados, one of them. She's still applying for jobs. She secured a job. She's working remote for 6 months. She's on a £500 a day or $550 a day role. She's working remote from Bahamas. So, I'm very jealous of that. But it just shows that you can work from anywhere in the world at the moment as long as, obviously the timescales work. So, that's just important to mention. Don't be so specific to your geographical location. And just hints and tips with regards to your job search. Try and reach out to as much as your network as possible, whether it be a previous colleague, a previous manager. Don't be afraid. They might know somebody. They might know somebody hiring. Although VMAGROUP is one of the biggest recruitment companies within corporate communications, there are other recruitment companies out there. So get in touch with them, see what they have on at the moment. It's a very difficult time, so just try and say to try and open up your network, your chances and opportunities of securing something as much as possible. When in the job search. And the last point, sorry Stuart, last point, apologies, is that you do follow up with the recruitment contact with the hiring manager. From those 500 applications I may receive for one role, maybe 1 or 2 might follow up with me directly, whether it's LinkedIn or email, and the chances are they're the ones that are most suited to the role because they really feel this is something that I can do. And if they're going to go out of their way to follow up, I'm going to look at them. I appreciate that people can click a button and apply for a role, but it doesn't mean a huge amount nowadays. If you are going to follow up, then that means a lot more. So again, that's it from me. I will again thank you for Stuart for joining us today, and I'll hand over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew and Matt, and thanks for the invitation and for setting up this morning. Okay, well, thanks. Firstly, thanks for the introduction. A little bit about me. I've been an interim manager for about 14 years now, and I expect most interims will empathise with this slide. It's very much a case of, famine or feast. One is actually either earning reasonably good money in most cases or almost none at all. And most of my work has been project-based, large-scale projects, but interspace with quite a lot of crisis communications, as Andrew and Matt have said, and very generous in their summation. I often say if an organisation doesn't have a crisis when I start, I can usually provide one. But covering a number of areas. Pandemic flu was the first one. That was for Department of Health. That was planning. That was very high level strategy for the NHS. As good luck or bad luck would have it, that segued very, very neatly into the swine flu pandemic of 2009-10. People forget about swine flu, but it was a genuine pandemic, albeit one that, as it has turned out, very much less intrusive than COVID. Last year was mostly spent on Operation Yellowhammer for the Department for International Trade. Yellowhammer was and is the sharp edge of Brexit. It's the no deal worst case scenario around life, limb, and national security impacts of a no deal Brexit. So that, as Andrew's mentioned, that may yet return to being on the agenda. And most recently, it was hired in February for a company called Study Group, who specialise in bringing Chinese and other overseas students to British and Western universities. So it's been a bit of a perfect storm for them, and not least because you may remember back in February, the Brighton super spreader was seen as a big threat, and Study Group, as luck would have it, are of course based in Brighton. So that was a bit of a storm for them. They hired me for 6 weeks to do some preparatory work around this newfangled coronavirus thing, and of course I've been there ever since. And I was in fact thinking, as Yellowhammer was ending, that it's quite like this crisis communication stuff in a way. It's a pity there isn't, I don't know, a global health emergency that I could get involved in. So a case of care for what you wish for. Right. So what is a critical incident or a crisis? Well, a critical incident has whole books written about what the difference between a critical incident and a crisis and a disaster is, but a generally accepted definition is as a serious situation that demands immediate action, and in our arena, communications activities beyond the normal business processes of the organisation. So it's the first thing that's slightly obvious is it's business as unusual. It's not the usual run-of-the-mill activities. Some definitions include the words like unexpected and unexpected occurrence. I would challenge that. I think if you have business continuity plans and have done some thinking around your organisation's risk register and how their crisis response might look like, you can say it's unlikely and you can say it's high risk, but unexpected, maybe not. I mean, there might be a few things that we just have never thought of. Also, there's a debate around the degree to which reputational risk interfaces with critical incident planning, and that's something I'll touch on in a minute. So, as I say, it can be almost anything. It can be something that causes interruption to one's business interruption. Can be what used to be called acts of God. I think the insurance sector still calls them that. Can be a serious accident, like we saw yesterday in Aberdeenshire with the train crash. Or it can be man-made. It can be something ranging from deliberate vandalism right up to a terrorist incident. And of course, that's something increasingly in recent years we've had to take on board. And that can result in a direct threat to one's personnel and one's business, but more likely in most cases some sort of evacuation, some sort of lockdown within an area while the police and the security forces saw what's going on. There's a sort of subset of this around cybercrime and data protection, which I won't go into a huge amount of detail at the moment. We could have a whole seminar on that, and that can be accidental or deliberate. I think it's worth stating that most data breaches are accidental. It's people leaving the laptop on the tube. It's that kind of phenomenon rather than deliberate attempt to damage one's business. But one has to be guarded against both. A pandemic sort of sits somewhere between the two in terms of it's largely natural, as far as we know, but human factors and how one handles the crisis can affect that. And this is just to show, remind us that this is a multidisciplinary thing. As communicators, we're usually quite good at dealing with or talking to people in HR or IT. With crisis and critical incident communications, you need to speak very, very closely to health and safety people, possibly quite a lot more connectivity with premises and the business continuity side of that, particularly if one is looking at how one would evacuate one's building and what the internal comms around getting those messages over would look like. And an interesting one that crops up a lot in this is the question of multiple occupancy. If you're part of a building with several different tenants or stakeholders, you might literally need to speak to the people above and below you to ensure that communications plans around a critical incident affecting the whole building are taken into account. Okay, so the critical incident pathway looks, broadly speaking, like this in most cases. So there'll be what you might call business as usual, that column on the left. The operations part of the business is doing what it does to keep the business going as per normal, and there's a communication stream that people like us will be involved in supporting that. Then something comes along, that little flag, the red and yellow flag comes along to upset the apple cart. And again, it's touched on earlier by Matt and Andrew. There's an immediate response to that. There's the first few minutes and hours in which a critical incident team or something equivalent to that is set up to control the response to the incident, and that would have a communication stream underpinning that activity. Usually one would hope to have a communications expert in the critical incident team to help the business with its response. And then we move on to a longer term mitigation and recovery phase. Things start to settle down again. There's operational activity undertaken to address the longer term issues, which might include psychological and physical damage to the building, but psychological damage to staff and personnel as well. That might potentially be an issue over many years. And the communications, people updating the resources, signposting to new sources of information, and communications to the broader stakeholder base, all of which feeds into this horrid term, the new normal. But however we like it, there will be a new normal, and that then feeds around the line across the bottom. That kind of feeds back into the new normal of the day job. So that's just to underscore that point. The future will not resemble the past. There'll be a certain return to normality, but it'll be subtly different, if only because of the way we look to plan these things for the future. So the first thing to say, and Andrew touched on this, is within the first few hours, you can't be concerned about the bottom line. Your moral and other responsibilities are to the health and safety of the people affected, be it staff, the public, other stakeholders, or whatever. So the normal rule book, to an extent, has to be suspended. As with everything else, and a theme I'll touch on throughout this talk is what we're seeing here is a concertina or an acceleration of things and trends that we as communicators will find normal anyway in our conversations with sometimes skeptical senior management. You know, the honesty in our reporting. What I can tell you now is, what I can't tell you is. That sort of messaging is doubly, triply important in a crisis. It's got to be really, really measured and reassuring. All our people are safe, assuming that is true. It's not, say so. And above all, we are on top of the situation. You may not feel that way, you probably won't, but it's how you project. And that is part of your resilience building around how your teams, your organization responds to this, but also how your external stakeholders. And again, and this would occur ordinarily, you need to jump very, very quickly on inaccuracies and rumours. So what could possibly go wrong? Well, obviously quite a lot. I think the biggest is the top one there, that management, senior management can tend to have its head in the sand. It's almost like they feel that by doing continuity planning, they're almost kind of jinxing the organisation that what they're planning for will actually happen. So it's that failure to plan ahead. It's failure to have robust and exercised business continuity plans. There's no point somebody like me writing a business continuity plan. I'll happily do it for you and bank the check, but unless it's then tested every 3 to 6 months, it's not worth the paper it's written on. Clearly and self-evidently, it's too late to do that once the crisis occurs. Unfortunately, an awful lot of organisations just don't get that. And that really comes from the top. And the one message I would say to communications colleagues is we now have the right to bang very firmly on the door of chief executives and chief operating officers to say, you must do this. So it does give us, and I'll touch on this later, it does give us the ammunition that we require to really demand a place on the top table for some of these things for communications. And I know we all sometimes feel it's a bit of a Cinderella discipline. Failure to engage with the media is a classic. No comment is rarely an option, and particularly not in a crisis. And it's failure to do what I hinted at earlier, failure to demonstrate that control, that concern, that empathy and that credibility. And another one, again, I'm being overcritical of senior management, it tends to be them who resort to this, an over-reliance on a legalistic defence. You know, we have ticked all the right boxes, therefore we're okay. An excellent case study in this for all the wrong reasons, do Google it if you get the chance, is the complete screw up that Pan Am made over the Lockerbie disaster with the most incredibly insensitive and cack-handed public relations approach in the aftermath of that horrible tragedy. And indeed, there are analysts who attribute Pan Am's eventual demise, at least in part, to their their lack of empathy, the lack of everything in handling that emergency. Sticking with airlines for a moment, Monarch in the foreground, they're out of the picture because of course they've gone bust. But the other three airlines, they're British Airways, Ryan and EasyJet, have all been in the news recently with COVID-19. Not always for the best reasons. And one thing we can't do anything about this immediately during a crisis, but one thing we need to be very aware of as part of our day job and how our organisation would respond in a crisis is the organisation's brand and its reputation. We live in an age of the likeable brand, which means that some organisations in a crisis are likely to be able to respond or be seen to respond much better, simply because the public mentality, the public mind is positive. Ryanair and EasyJet, interesting comparators here. They're both in the bargain bucket end of the market, but one always gets the sense that EasyJet, excuse the pun, gets the easier ride. They're a more likable brand. They're colourful. People tend to like EasyJet in a way that they barely tolerate Ryanair. So one could well imagine that, at least in part of the criticism of Ryanair that we've seen recently as opposed to EasyJet, maybe in part simply because of brand differentiation. And of course, that's a circular argument. It may well be that the way they respond and have set themselves up is such that they don't particularly go out their way to make themselves popular. Now, a big distinction with pandemics, which separates them out from pretty much every other crisis, which, with possible exception of war, is we don't know the duration, we don't know how serious it's going to be, and we don't know what the outcome is. So the duration of a pandemic is a key differentiator from other disasters. Most disasters, most crises, however horrible, we know they're going to be over within a certain time. Even something as ghastly as a flood, we know pretty much certainty that the flood will recede within days or at worst weeks. The aftermath maybe take longer to deal with, but we know it's going to go away, basically. We unfortunately don't know that with a pandemic. We can hope, but we don't know. And biologically, as animals, we're not actually very good at coping with that. We're actually quite good at coping with a crisis. Our biological flight and fight mechanisms, our adrenaline kicks in, and it tides us over that first few hours or days. It's in some ways much more difficult because we're not hot wired to do it, to cope with something of longer duration. So resilience is utterly vital here. Again, the sort of good news, bad news for us as internal communications people is the absolute criticality of the internal communications, both before, during and after a crisis. This whole theme around resilience, which I could talk at length on, but I'll just touch on it now, particularly over the protracted, long-term struggle. And it's probably not realistic, it isn't realistic to have people in the easy zone while there's a crisis going on, but everything we can do to keep staff and colleagues and other stakeholders in that stretched comfort zone and stop them drifting into the red zone. If we see them going to the red zone, do something about it, whilst recognizing that once the challenge is over, there may well be a longer term piece of work that one needs to do around post-traumatic stress disorder. We were already hearing talk of a mental health epidemic arising out of as a secondary, almost a comorbidity of the pandemic. So it's certainly one that is going to be with us. Consequences are going to be with us for many years. I'm going to talk about just a broader thing generally, which I think is something that is a general theme of communications across the board, but again is very much focused and accelerated in a crisis. And Dickens summed this up very well in Tale of Two Cities. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity, and that so sums up our society today. We have, as a generation, better access to data than any previous generation. It's just we don't seem very good at using it. We have this information overload. We have the most crazy conspiracy theories gaining traction very rapidly. This is actually not even new research. This is, as you'll see, based on research done before and during swine flu, but it shows who people trust. And the key messaging here is that exactly the same words delivered by a different person or a different institution within that hierarchy can land much more successfully than others. Surprisingly low BBC there. I think that's part of the general incredulity at media, but it's quite surprising to see the BBC so low. then government, my local hospital, Department of Health. Why people thought that was different to the government, who knows? And then the NHS, and then top of the heap, my doctor or GP, by a very considerable margin. If you add those top two together, well over 74, 75%. Sitting above those is the man you meet down the pub, the chap you know who's a hospital porter, or she's an auxiliary nurse, or somebody who works, you know, at the coalface, who has seen with their own eyes the cardboard coffins in storage, you know, for a mass death event around a pandemic. All the evidence is that they will be believed and be taken credibly. Again, it's part of this whole arena in which we operate now about seeking brand authenticity and your spokesperson being somebody who is credible, and that is not these days somebody in a suit, if indeed it ever was. We've had the real decline of the authority message. So again, this underscores the good news in a perverse sort of way for us, is get that internal communications right and get that on the agenda, so you do not have people going off message. I mean, they still will, but at least you've got a way of controlling it. I'm just going to flip back to the slide for a moment. I've covered this because, as you'll see from that, the top three, arguably, are a reflection of the sort of secular religion we have in this country around the NHS and the esteem with which the NHS is held, which we've all seen with the 8 o'clock applause and so forth. And it's probably no coincidence for that reason that the government messaging, at least in the early days, very much around this sort of messaging around protect the NHS, literally and figuratively in larger letters than anything else, very prominent use there of the NHS logo. You'll see a very clear contrast between what was done 10 years ago with pandemic flu, where the message was keep yourself and your family safe, so very much personal to the individual, and the NHS imagery very much, relatively speaking, sort of downplayed by that. It's an interesting change in the way the government is approaching this. This is just to summarize the point I was just making. We've seen this collapse, really, these contradictory social trends. I think it's fair to say in most cases, historically, our messaging has been very much of the kind of Ministry of Truth, top-down approach, and increasingly that's going to be difficult to sustain. It's just emphasizing this breakdown of trust of traditional authority messages. So to sum up, if in a crisis, have a plan. If you don't have a plan, at least act as if you have one. That confidence is vital, both from you as a communicator or us as communicators, but also in guiding our senior management and other people. Build and maintain resilience of teams, particularly if they're working under a lot of pressure, which they will be. Keep an eye out for those issues I spoke of just now around trust and confidence, bearing in mind that a crisis will magnify and accelerate any existing issues with the brand, and look to see whether we can continue to build those issues around the need for authenticity. And then after the deluge, the aftercare service, as it were, the recovery and new normal phase. Again, a lot of this should be motherhood and apple pie to us. Thank those both within and outside the organisation who helped. Particularly those who maybe went above and beyond. Collect lessons learned. We always say this at the end of a major program. It never gets done, although I would say with one exception. I have to give a gold star to my colleagues at the Department of International Trade, who actually did do a very good lessons learned exercise after Yellowhammer, which I guess they may be beginning to dust off now for the end of the year and the end of transition period. Remember also, and this is a difficult part, possibly particularly for us as interims who may be moving on to our next gig, there may be long-term issues. There may well be psychological issues around the organisation. There may be psychological issues around yourself, and that's something just to bear in mind as you try to pace yourself and try to keep grounded in this. That we're all human, and we may ourselves be affected. Classically, not during the heat of battle. It's the post-traumatic stress that damages longer term the soldier in combat, or the person who's been, or the first responder who has been through an emergency. And I'm not comparing us with those, but nonetheless, there is still an element of that we may encounter in our organisation and indeed in ourselves. And get ready for the next one. Next slide is nearly the last, you'll be glad to know. The good news that I've hinted at, I hope, through this presentation is for us as communicators, communications, as we would say, we know, is a mitigator in a crisis. I think one could actually argue in some cases it's the only mitigator, but that for that reason, our input should be very valuable. One thing I would say to colleagues, if you're joining a big project or a big organisation or even a little one, is beta path to the risk register. Get to see the risk register, because that will have been poured over by the top downwards. That will be very much at the senior level of share of mind, where sometimes both as interims and as communicators, we find it sometimes difficult to get a seat at the top table. So own at least parts of the risk register by saying, aha, the communications can mitigate this line, that, and own particularly things like the media response and things that come very much into our purview. You may have seen this before. This is a chart doing the rounds in LinkedIn a few weeks ago. I have no idea how authoritative this is. I've tried to find out who finance facts are, and I'm afraid failed. But if this is to be believed, this is actually quite good news for us. This is the top skills and demand post-COVID-19, and as you'll see, quite rightly, communications is top of the heap, and actually by a fairly considerable margin. So I think my conclusion is, it can be an ill wind that blows nobody any good, and it may be just finally our time as communicators has come. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Stuart. That was really, really informative, insightful, and I just want to say thank you again for taking part and sharing all of your experience with the session today. So I hope everybody found that really useful as well. We have around 5-10 minutes left for any questions for myself, Andrew, or Stuart, if anybody has any questions with regards to the markets or the presentation. So feel free to type away in the quick Q&A parts or the chats.
I was asked if I could just reiterate the anti-example. The anti-example was Pan American, who really, I won't go into the details, but it was an incredibly cack-handed response to the Lockerbie disaster. So do hunt that one down. It's well worth a read for all the wrong reasons.
Perfect. We'll give it a few minutes and.
Are most people working on crisis comms at the moment, Matt? Is that people's experience? A lot of people have been sort of seconded in.
Absolutely, yes. I think that although maybe not all companies are particularly hiring these crisis communications interim positions, which of course there have been some cases such as yourself, and we have placed those roles. The majority of people have been seconded into that or put on that crisis communications team, as you said. Obviously, maybe not so much anymore as we've mentioned, but definitely March, April time, 100%. So people, communicators now are getting a lot more experience. Someone such as yourself with your swine flu pandemic and other examples have lots, but this has been an opportunity for a lot of people to gain that experience for future crises.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing one does in a crisis as a communicator that, in a sense, that one doesn't do normally. It's just to a very, very much more compacted timescale. You need to get that press release out within minutes rather than days, which on a plus side does enable us to cut through the chatter. I'm sure we all have the experience of the press release that has to be cleared by every flipping level up to the chairman and then down again, and they just don't have that luxury. I would give a tick mark to my current people at Study Group. I don't know how they've turned around that organisation and put all of the learning, or most of the learning, online, and incredibly fast. So people are flexible and resilient. We tend to diss ourselves and say we're very silo based and all the rest of it, but when it really comes to it, we can actually pull the chocks out.
Absolutely. I've got a question that's come in from, I'll go to Mark. I've got a few questions coming in now. Mark Elliott, so thank you for your question. Regarding the interim secure crisis communications roles, do you think any of those assignments will morph into business as usual? That's a good question, and it definitely would depend on the business's resilience, business performance, and the appetite for communications within the team. I think Stuart could be a bit of an example of this one. I mean, Stuart, do you want to tell the session, the group, about your initial time frame and your initial contract and how that's kind of morphed?
Well, my initial contract was 6 weeks, and I've been there 7, nearly 8 months now. Will it morph into business as usual? Yeah, well, hopefully. I mean, if people take on board the kind of messaging that we're seeing, and the kind of emphasis that communications might have, I think there is a distinct window of opportunity for communications really to start to box even further above its weight. I think where there might be some pickings in the medium term would be around once bitten, twice shy. You know, organisations who've struggled with their business planning, their continuity planning, might wake up and smell the coffee. And I need the business continuity. Some of the work that I've in fact done is just reminding people, you know, there are other crises other than pandemics. The most likely ones are more likely to be, you know, flood, fire, natural disasters, possibly terrorism. So your business continuity plan can't be too focused on the pandemic. There's always a tendency to fight the last war. But you know, at least if you've demonstrated an expertise in the heat of it, that you know, we can go on to do other work as well. Have I managed multiple crises at the same time? No, it's always possible. I think my advice in this situation is take a long, deep breath. I haven't. There is, you know, there's talk now we might have swine flu coming back alongside COVID. So who knows? You know, when I imagine the people up in Aberdeenshire at the moment having to cope with a natural disaster or an accident on top of COVID, I think you would just have to prioritise and say, you know, the life, limb and life, limb issues have got to be more important even than the pandemic planning.
Go back to the very first question. I would also agree that once you do go into a project, you show your worth, you perform highly, you can then become quite, you know, the communications team, the business can really depend on you, and that you can be you pulled into different projects or more of a business as usual position, sometimes going into, you know, maybe a temp to perm type scenario. So, you know, Stuart's definitely an example of this, you know, 6 weeks to 7 months type role. We've had I've known of contractors that have gone in for 3 months and lasted a business for many years on different projects. One of the reasons why R35 is changed, but we won't go into that. So yes, that can definitely happen once you kind of show, you know, how your worth, I guess, in that sense. A question from Andrew Morrison: do you see a juniorization of comms roles by companies, i.e. hiring executives at the manager level rather than strategists at the director level? Should we ignore the distinction? That's a very good question, actually. I have seen that at the moment, again, clients will try and, you know, get someone in for as little as cost as possible. So they are trying to do that where possible. But, you know, what we do at VMA Group is when we share candidates, when we share a shortlist, we like to share candidates at different levels. So say it's an interim role, maybe £400 to £500 a day. We'll share people at that more junior end. I wouldn't say £400 is junior, but at that end of the scale, and then the 500. And 9 times out of 10, once the more senior candidate will sit in front of the client, they will see that it's worth bringing that person in, and they will decide to bring in the more senior person. I wouldn't get too hung up on job titles as well. That's just something to mention there. Whether it's perm or contract, you know, you can get a communications specialist on £250 a day or £600 a day. You can get a head of internal comms on 50k or 120k. So it's not always reflective of the pay grade or the strategic element of the role. You can generally get more of a sense of that from the remit and the job description. But I would say that its clients are trying to do that, and where, you know, maybe candidates in the market are a little bit more flexible now, so they can, you know, a candidate that wouldn't maybe have traditionally gone below £500 a day, maybe saying, look, I've been out of work for a little bit of time, so I'll do that, and I'll bring that rate down. We are seeing that a bit more. So I've definitely seen that. There's a question from Matt for Stuart. How do you suggest crisis communications plan incorporate or respond to audience fatigue, particularly if and when there's a second lockdown or second wave of restrictions?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one, and it's probably one of the more difficult communications things to solve. I think you just have to keep supporting staff. You have to be seen to doing it. It would be a very brave organisation at the moment that treated its staff in a high-handed manner. That one hears about this. You can keep resilience building through a number of tools. Something as simple as a WhatsApp group can be very, very effective, particularly if people are working or teams are working 24/7, of keeping that going, of humanizing it. I say WhatsApp deliberately because everyone's got it. It's something they're very familiar with. I find it very, very effective as a social tool in Department of International Trade, where people are emailing the district liners up the creek, or we're ordering pizzas, that kind of level, and just keep very close communication with people, but very empathic, and not water down exactly, but infuse the clunky lockdown communications with as much humor, but more than that, as much humanity as you can. And people, when they talk about resilience, and if you'd asked in an interview question, how do you deal with resilience? People sometimes tend to internalize it and say, oh, well, I do yoga, or I go for a long run, or I box, or whatever. All very important. But in building resilience in others, it's how you project. It is absolutely to keep calm and carry on is the message. And how you do that, and how your organization does that, calm, measured. We have this under control, but we know people are suffering, and this is what we're doing about it.
Thank you, Stuart. A few more questions have come through. I will just say, conscious of time, I'm personally happy to sit around for as long as the questions come.
Yeah.
Probably not till 5 o'clock tonight, but for a good maybe 10 minutes or so. Stuart, I don't know if you're able to answer a few more questions you've got.
Yeah.
So, but of course, everybody welcome to come in and out of the webinar, or leave if you have something to go to, of course. But just a few more questions. So from Edward, Stuart, in your experience, do you think companies spend enough time and effort on post-crisis on trying to learn lessons and putting them into practice to prevent repeats?
In a word, no. They don't do enough before. And every time there's a headline crisis like a 9/11 or a pandemic, we think, oh, this will now focus minds. It's difficult, absent a crisis, to get minds focused. As I say, I kind of done it myself. You can write a business continuity plan for an organization, and you'd really need to make sure that this is then rehearsed. And that is difficult, because managers and people are busy, and saying to them, no, you've got to take mandatory, because it can't, a crisis isn't optional. You either have it or you don't. So the exercise has got to be mandatory, and getting everyone to participate in that is actually quite difficult. In the aftermath, again, we're facing what we often face with projects generally, is there's this nice line at the bottom of the Excel spreadsheet that says, do a lessons learned exercise, and 9 times out of 10 people just don't. And clearly they will need to do so, if only to understand what the new normal looks like, because we are rebuilding and reinventing companies as we speak in ways that are not necessarily within our control. And that might be, for example, we might find that actually people don't want to come back to the office. They're saving several £1,000s on commuting fees. They can work quite happily from home. They can look after the kids. Things like that are unpredictable. And the organization, all organizations, once this is under control, will need to do that. Second wave has been touched on. Whether we're into a second wave or a continuation of the first one, I don't think anyone knows, to be honest. It won't be over till it's over, and even then, the World Health Organization is predicting we could be facing this for years. My sort of fear in this, and it sort of happened after swine flu, because swine flu, as pandemics go, was a pretty feeble affair, is that people go, oh, sorry, that's over with, we can roll over and go back to sleep. And what is the next pandemic going to look like? Horrible to say, there will be another pandemic. So people need to think from that downwards. And it's a good excuse is not the right word, it's a good reason to revisit the business continuity. What will you do if the building flooded? or burnt to the ground. You know, what would do if the internet failed catastrophically? All these kind of what if issues, these black swan incidents that people don't like to confront because we don't like to confront those sort of things. That's just nature. Really get organisations to focus on. And I think to be quite selfish, you know, there's pickings for the likes of us in making that argument and making that debate, and then saying, oh, by the way, through our chums at VMA, you know, we know somebody who can do this for you.
That leads you on to the next question. Actually, there's one on the group chat from Claire for Stuart. 14 years contracting experience. How do you generally find your contracts? Is it through recruitment agencies, contacts, or LinkedIn?
Mostly agencies. It's mostly them contacting me, but with kind of constant reminder of one's existence. In the early days, I think it was more the other way around. It was very much, you know, because one was a younger and unknown quantity. I would say proportionally, most of it has been a phone call from somebody like Matt saying, we've got this option, which is nice because it means that the CV has landed with the right sort of audiences. It is a bit, I mean, Matt and Andrew, forgive me for saying, it is a bit of a numbers game, of course. You know, one has to get the CVs out regularly. I was saying before we started, in a rare moment of marketing insight, I did almost a spam email to every agency I could think of saying, oh, by the way, this COVID-19 thing, or it wasn't even called that then, coronavirus, I've got some experience in this. And it was just a good way of reminding people of one's existence, even if they didn't have any work. Of course, with VMA, of course, they did. LinkedIn, I would say, is important. I go as far as to say vital. Matt and Andrew will confirm if this is wrong, but one gets the sense that the minute a name comes up, people will go on LinkedIn and see what the person is saying about themselves, what others about to say. So a good LinkedIn profile is important. When I started off in this game, it dates me slightly. You know, it was a website. You had to have your own website. I don't think I've updated my website for 6 months, to be honest. It's much less important to have your own website. Although it is a partial offence against R35. Just put that one in, you know. So it's a mix. I would say over 14 years, probably 2/3 recruitment, 1/3 personal contact. I think once through LinkedIn directly, maybe twice.
And I will say that Stuart is very ahead of the curve, and the only candidate of you know, however many hundreds, thousands in my network that actually messaged me. I think it was end of February, early March time, and you emailed me and just said, look, I've got pandemic experience. This coronavirus sounds like it might get quite big at some point. You know, keep me in mind. And I kind of thought, you know, great to know, but unlikely that we'll have anything. And I think I wrote back and said, you know, thanks very much. And then a few days later, lo and behold, a client calls in and says, we need somebody with pandemic, you know, crisis communications experience. And that was one of the only jobs I've worked on where I've just sent them one candidate because I had that one candidate there ready, and you know, I why not? You know, you just slotted straight in. So, you know, and I will say Stuart's very good at this. That you know, we've met a few times, and he'll always, you know, send me a reminder coming to the end of the contract. Just check in every now and then, and I'd recommend that for people looking as well. It just keeps people kind of front of mind. So a few more questions have come in. We touched about the new normal. There was another question from anonymous Stuart. I'm not sure if you touched on this previously. Stuart, how do you prepare for the new normal when if the situation continues to shift and if there's no new normal?
That's an interesting. I mean, that's a good one, an interesting one, because I don't think there's a potted answer to that by inherent perhaps in the question. I think it is something where communications, because of the nimbleness and the flexibility that we bring to the party, is very well placed to start sort of brainstorming that. As the minute the dust starts to settle, actually take the soundings of staff, you know, staff surveys, that kind of thing. We've done quite a lot of that at Study Group, of actually taking the pulse of how employees are feeling about working from home and the possibility of coming back, and what would they think if. So mapping out that, you know, what if what if 80% of our staff never come to the office again? I'm not saying that's what's going to happen, but that sort of possibility. We can help businesses by scoping those options, by testing them in a reasonably rigorous fashion, alongside colleagues in HR and so on, and actually helping businesses and the staff that make them up kind of sort of own those solutions, while clearly guiding them towards the business solution that the organisation wants. Will there be a new normal? Well, in an absolute sense, of course, there never is. Technological and the sort of pest analysis type things are always going to come along, and the proof of the pudding of any organisation, even in peacetime, is that the nimble ones will survive, and the silo, the old star mentality ones like Pan Am, possibly like BA, will not survive. And that's free market capitalism. That's the world we live in, for better or worse. I mean, in a crisis, it just kind of accelerates this, and in ways that we can't really predict. So I think I would start to take the pulse of staff probably now, as to how they're feeling now and how they might feel in the future, and present that back with HR colleagues to the business. Say, look, this is what the squeeze points, this is what the choke points are going to be, and this is what the people regard as an actual secondary gain of all this. Because it sounds perverse to say it, but there are good things that will come out of this as well, and maybe we can start to focus on some of those as the months go by.
Absolutely. I will say that there's a few more questions. Sorry, I got a call coming in to cancel. A few more questions to answer. We probably won't take any more. We'll probably wrap up within the next few moments. So just conscious of Stuart's time, and it's overrun a little bit now.
Take offline.
Absolutely, yeah. Feel free to connect with myself or Stuart or Andrew on LinkedIn, and you can always pick up the conversation on LinkedIn. Unfortunately, Andrew he didn't want to interject and kind of cut off Stuart mid-presentation, but he had to leave for a meeting, so he isn't able to answer the question, and I don't feel as though I'm qualified enough to answer the question with regards to furlough. So apologies, Mark, on that. There is a question from Edward with regards to so Matt, our company is now trying to hire on a 2-for-1 basis, i.e. head of marketing and communications roles, when those are too broad and often require different skill sets and career backgrounds. So firstly, I do agree that yes, they're very broad area. I don't personally touch on marketing, so I do just really work on corporate communications positions. However, I have seen that particularly in the permanent teams, they have recently advertised quite a few, 2 or 3 head of marketing and communications positions. I'm not sure if that is specifically on the back of cost cutting or because of COVID-19. It may well be. I've traditionally seen that more in maybe smaller organizations, or organizations that maybe don't understand the separate disciplines or don't understand the need for specialists in that area. But I haven't personally seen that on a contract desk. Even within corporate communications, I haven't seen somebody that's a client which needs everything. They normally look for specialists when recruiting on an interim basis, not normally generalists. So that's not something I see a huge amount on the interim side, if I'm honest. I believe there's one final question. Any thoughts and experience of how social is reshaping crisis management, especially in terms of gaining and maintaining control?
I got that. I mean, that's massive, and we could have another session on that. It's changed it completely. We were seeing the beginning of those trends, those contradictory trends that I touched on, before social media really kicked off. We saw that with the 2009 research around swine flu, where, although it was there, social media wasn't such a big deal. People were vaguely aware of, Twitter and so on. And I think, and one doesn't need to, one could spend all day discussing the pros and cons of it. It is so big now, it's impossible to ignore, and it's impossible not to have to use it. I think the only slight caveat I would say to that is, and I in a past life had to pull a staff member off this. He part of his role was responding to social media, and it he could have spent all day doing that. And I just said, no, we cannot respond to every troll, every lunatic, every conspiracy theory, but we can use it to connect, as I've hinted at with WhatsApp, and I mean, that's just one tool about many. We can use it to connect with staff and other stakeholders in ways that we've never been able to before. We're doing it, in a sense, we're doing it now. I mean, the technology to do this wouldn't have existed a few years ago. And there is, I don't think there is any bottled solution to this, but some brands, possibly EasyJet is one, I hinted at, you know, are very good at that likable brand and making that work for them. But even the most successful organization in this, you know, Apple is a case study. There was a time when everyone loved Apple because they were the underdog against Microsoft and IBM and all the rest of it. And I myself, I've used Macs for 30 years. Now they've become almost too big. It kind of goes full circle. Now they're really quite struggling, certainly finding it much more difficult to make that balance work. So there is no canned solution, but it's certainly not something we can ignore. And in a crisis, it's certainly a very good way of maintaining resilience if it's done properly. There are some, you know, negatives. It can go terribly wrong. I could dwell on that at length, but I'll move on in the interest of time.
Well, thank you, Stuart, and thank you for all those the questions coming through and the answers from Stuart, and for the case study and the presentation today. That's really informative. And as I say, as Andrew mentioned earlier, the Sing events and the webinars that used to do lots of face-to-face events, of course, throughout VMAGROUP, not just interim focus, but across any kind of corporate communications and marketing topic. We will be hosting more webinars, so take a look on our LinkedIn accounts and our websites. I'm sure we'll be running more Sing events later in the year as well. So thank you for joining. I know it's overrun somewhat, so to take your attention for an hour and 15 minutes in such heat, I'm quite happy with that. So I hope you found it enjoyable, and thanks for joining, and enjoy the rest of the sunny heat wave.
Thanks, Matt.
See you later.
All right.